All right, good morning. I guess I probably don't need to yell since I have a microphone on. Welcome to the Snyder Trail. We are on Paradise Road on the north side of Highway 154. So if you go up and over Highway 154, you make a right on Paradise Road, and that takes you down to this whole area down here, which follows the San Ynez River. And there's a bunch of campgrounds along here, a bunch of day use, and so on. Lake Kachuma is just behind Devin, who's holding the camera right now.
Yes.
Thank you, Devin. And so here we are at the Snyder Trail. The Snyder Trail is going to go up the north side of the San Ynez range here. So the San Ynez Mountains, which we may have told you already by this point, are a part of the transverse ranges. So there's a massive continental plate that goes all the way basically down California longitudinally. So it's created this continuous but kind of differentiated range. And so we're in the transverse range here. And the transverse range is unique in California because it runs east to west. And so it's kind of intuitive for Santa Barbara's coast because Santa Barbara's coast also runs east to west. But that's why it's called the transverse range. And the San Ynez range is on the south end of that. And then as you cross the San Ynez River, which we'll get some footage of, or maybe we already have, you get into the Sierra Madre range. So the San Ynez River cuts those two ranges. So we're gonna be walking maybe just a mile or two up this trail, which is all we'd be doing if you were here as well. But this trail is awesome because it starts in this really nice oak woodland, and it's not just any oak woodland. We're in a really unique area where you get coast live oaks next to valley oaks, next to blue oaks, all different kinds of oaks, including shrub oaks. And then it's going to transition really quickly and starkly into chaparral and even some grasslands. So I'm really excited that you're here virtually. I really wish you were here with us right now, but hopefully we've told you up to this point in the quarter that these plants that we're introducing to you, most of them you can find no matter where you are, whether you're in Southern California, Northern California, and at least to this point, hiking trails are not closed. So it's totally recommended that you all get out there, and as long as you're keeping your distance, even though you can't be here with us botany nerds in person and feel our nerd awkward vibes, you can go out with your actual friends and family and go meet some of these species for your own. So without any further ado, let's make our way up the trail. All right. Sweet. So by now you've seen this tree hopefully many times in your life, and now we've talked about it in this class, but Devin and I were just walking by this specimen of a coast live oak. Specimen not necessarily in its height or size, but this thing is extremely happy right now. This is one of the more fertile coast live oaks I've ever seen, especially for this size. It's just in full bloom. So we've talked about the term where you have male and female flowers on different structures on the same plant. Corn is another example of that. I'm going to let you take a second to think of what that word is. We call it monoecious. So right now you're seeing these dangling male flowers hanging down, ready for any wind, which hasn't shown up yet, to disperse their gametophytes onto a female flower, which is just a little baby acorn at this point. Once that female flower gets pollinated and fertilized, then she'll expand into an ovary and make an acorn. But we just wanted to take a minute to show you a coast live oak in full male bloom right now. Hello again. We've now made another stop at a real nice Quercus agrifolia, which is also just raging in full male bloom right now. And some of this lower foliage of this coast live oak is being taken advantage of by this review plant here. This review plant, which we're calling California manroot due to the size of its massive underground root, and or it's called wild cucumber. It's in the cucumber family, or the Cucurbitaceae, and Devin's zooming in on some of its tiny little flowers here. It's tiny little flowers, which one of these flowers will have a little ovary on it, and that ovary will end up expanding to a fruit of this size, and it'll actually get about, they can get 4 or 5 times bigger than that, but they make this big spiky ball. It's essentially the same fruit type as a cucumber or squash. Right on. Cool. All right, so time to meet our first new species for this trip here, which is Natalie's favorite tree, I believe. It's one of my favorites. It's any California botanist, this is going to be on their list. It's iconic for California, and that's the valley oak. So it is a true oak, so we're in the genus Quercus, and in this case, this species is called Quercus lobata. Lobata, which is describing the deep lobing of the leaves, which we'll show you here in a minute. This is one of California's most iconic trees because it was a really good indicator for the early settlers, and of course not just the early settlers, but the indigenous people to here, where there was a lot of deep water. And where there's a lot of deep water, there's typically fertile soils, and that's why, for the most part, these trees occur in California's valleys where the soils are most fertile. It's a good indicator for that. For that reason, they've also been just about completely wiped out. And so California's rangelands, really, on old ranches, are the only places where you're going to see big old valley oaks. And it's the second largest species of oak in the world, actually. You can always recognize them, not just by the leaves, but by this massive canopy that they'll put out. And this is a relatively young oak, maybe 100, 150 years old. These things can live several hundred years. And they'll make real deeply checkered bark, which we'll show you here in a minute, and maybe we can even find a better version of that. So we've seen a lot of the coast live oaks so far. This is our first deciduous oak, and there are many oaks that drop their leaves every year. So being that we're on the north side of the San Ynez Range, it's a lot colder here. So where it's colder, like Devin can attest to, you have a lot more plants that say, okay, when it's this cold, I'm not going to deal with trying to keep my leaves. I'm going to drop them and basically shut everything down for the winter. The valley oak is one that does that. So it's just making new leaves for the year, and you can always pretty much tell when a plant is deciduous and just leafing out because these leaves are real delicate and you can tell they're new. So it's just now in the process of laying down new cells, and now all the cells for this leaf have already been laid down. And over the course of the year, it's going to be strengthening this leaf and making all kinds of secondary compounds, and it'll get more tough and leathery until it's time to drop them again. So you can see on the underneath the leaves here, before the leaves even popped out, the male catkins or male inflorescences popped out, and hopefully found another female mate on another individual to make a fruit with. So this particular species, the Spanish noticed when they were coming through California, and because of the shape of the leaves on this real deep lobing of the leaves, it reminded them of a species of oak that's common in Europe, which is Quercus robur. So they called these trees robles, which is the town Paso Robles up in San Luis Obispo County is named after, and there are all kinds of other streets, towns, whatever around California named after this tree. All right, so we, as you can see by the topography here, we're starting to work our way up the ridge and away from the valley where we saw that last valley oak, and off the drainage as well. So we are very quickly, in just a matter of a couple hundred yards, in a much drier habitat and environment. It doesn't look all that dry right now because we've had a nice miracle March of rain. But this is much drier, and one of our best indicators for that is the fact that we're picking up a new species of oak. This oak here, which can make a pretty majestic tree, so it's a true oak. We're in the genus Quercus, and this is Quercus douglasii. So reminding you again that oaks are in the family, the Fagaceae. Quercus douglasii is one of California's most drought-tolerant oak species, at least as far as tree oaks go. So it can handle living on steep slopes where they only get real ephemeral, fleeting water. For that reason, they grow really slowly. And Natalie and I can both tell you, we've had a little bit of experience with their wood, on just how strong it is because it grows so slowly and lays down so much cellulose and lignin and so on. So blue oaks can be distinguished from valley oaks and other kinds of oaks based on their bark, and this gets to be a little bit more nuanced, but you're seeing their bark is somewhat furrowed, so there's some kind of indents that go along the bark, but these furrows run kind of linearly. They almost make strips going down the trunk, as opposed to a real mature valley oak, which hopefully we'll see at some point, that makes more of kind of a squared, big, furrowed, almost checker. So let's head over to some foliage here. So if you were here with us right now, then you'd be able to tell, and maybe you can already tell based on just how kind of bright green and nascent all the leaves look, that this is another deciduous oak. So blue oaks can kind of look similar. The foliage can kind of look similar to valley oaks because their leaves are also somewhat lobed. And the lobing is not as regular. It's not as kind of jigsaw as the valley oak was. So it's not as deep, but you can get some lobing, and it can be a little bit difficult to tell them apart when the leaves are new like this. But one feature that you can really use to distinguish them, and I don't know how well we can zoom in on this, but if you look at the margin of the leaf, at the tip of one of those lobes is a tiny little tooth. And that's a really good way to distinguish a blue oak from a valley oak when these leaves are so young like this. You know another species that makes little teeth on its margins, and that's the coast live oak. But there's all kinds of ways to distinguish a blue oak from a coast live oak. And already these leaves are starting to make a little bit of wax on their surface, and that wax is and hairs are what is going to make these leaves eventually, once we're into kind of midsummer, look real blue. So when you're driving along Highway 101 and you see down kind of in the lowland, in the valley, you see some massive oaks with big old canopies that have kind of a lighter green leaf, then you're probably looking at valley oaks. You see some oaks that are following the drainages, maybe along the hills or alongside the road, and are a nice forest green color. Those are coast live oaks. And then when you start to look up on the hills in the drier zones and the canopy has a really nice blue color, you know you're looking at a blue oak. I don't remember if I said that this is Quercus douglasii is the scientific name. And there's a lot of plants in California with that specific epithet. And by now, maybe we've already told you about David Douglas, but if not, then I'm going to take that opportunity to do so. He's a real memorable Scottish botanist who worked for the Royal Botanical Society of England and went all over California, all over British Columbia, all over kind of the Pacific coast, collecting plants and risking his life to do so. He didn't speak the same language as the indigenous people, and so there's all kinds of accounts of misunderstandings where he's trying to shoot down acorns with a pistol and the indigenous people think they're trying to kill him and he's having to run for his life. He was a real badass, and so a lot of plants are named after him. With all of the crazy ways that he almost died, mostly collecting plants in California, what ended up taking him, as you'll read in your textbook, was on the big island of Hawaii. He was watching a bullfight go down and he fell into the arena. Some say he was pushed, and he was mauled to death by a captive bull. And that's how he lost his life. But David Douglas was a real special botanist, and for that reason his name has been remembered in many of our iconic plant species in California. Quercus douglasii. Then we're going to start to pick up a lot more of this coastal sagebrush. And now that we're starting to transition into more of a coastal scrub kind of habitat on its way into a chaparral, we're going to start picking up some species that we remember seeing in those plant communities. So here's Artemisia californica. If we pan over to the other side of the trail, then we pick up our ceanothus species that we've learned, as well as some different species of sage. We're looking at purple sage across the way there. So this is the point when we're going to transition from a coast live oak dominated woodland to a blue oak kind of dominated woodland, intermixed with some coastal scrub. And we're going to start working our way further up the hill and get into some chaparral. So right now we're in a transition point between two different plant communities. What is that called? It's called an ecotone. And one thing I love about this place is that the communities transition so quickly, but also there's a lot of overlap. So ecotone, of course, is just an English word that we've made up to try and understand something, describe something that we actually don't fully understand. And so I just love that there's kind of a gray area between communities and ecotones in this place. So let's continue on up the trail. Sweet. So we obviously try and show you reproductive characters as much as possible, because that's a really good way to identify plants. But a lot of times you don't have reproductive characters. And you're going to be walking around on a hike and wondering who this kind of old friend is that you know, but you just can't put your finger on what their name is. And so this one here would be much easier to tell if it was in flower. The flowers would look like a little monkey face, some think. But this is our old friend Diplochus or Antiochus, sticky monkey flower. And if I had any doubt, first I would look at the phyllotaxy, which remember is always a good way to distinguish any plant. And I'm seeing that there's 2 leaves at every node. And just by touching this plant, after I've determined that it's not going to give me a gnarly rash, I'm fine with touching it. And now my fingers are all sticky. So we know that the common name for this plant is sticky monkey flower. So we're seeing it in its vegetative state right now. And soon it'll be transitioning to a reproductive state and making those nice cream-colored orange flowers. So Diplochus or Antiochus, sticky monkey flower. All right, so everybody's just frothing right now. We're all excited because we've just come up on a really classic ecotone once again, the one that I promised you just a minute ago, where we were going to be coming from that oak woodland zone down in that drainage, and maybe you can tell that there's a lot of water down there. You see that green? There's a beautiful coast live oak that's in full bloom with male flowers right now, and you can see it's getting really dry. And I'm excited, Devin's excited, Blue the dog is excited because we're getting into chaparral, and this is where all the bunnies are. But we're starting to transition into coastal scrub, which as soon as you see Artemisia californica here, you know you're in coastal scrub, or at least transitioning into chaparral. Some other species that are indicative of coastal scrub. And then we can look up this hillside here and know that we're about to walk into just a straight up chaparral death zone. Those plants up there are adapted to not only drought, but fire. Before we walk into that chaparral, I'd like to introduce you to this plant here, which is in the pea family. The pea family, hopefully you're remembering right now, is Fabaceae. And this member here we call commonly deerweed. Deerweed, which is in the genus Acmispon. And this particular species is Acmispon glaber. And this is one of our kind of common of coastal scrub species. This one's drought deciduous. So it'll drop its leaves in the driest parts of late summer and fall. And it's actually got little compound leaves, which is really characteristic of the pea family as well. And in this case, they're not the pinnately compound, bipinnately compound leaves that we see a lot of times. These leaves will have anywhere from 3 to kind of 5 little leaflets. So they almost look palmately compound. And we're not going to get tied up on the specifics of and esoterics of whether this is pinnately compound, palmately compound. We can let the botany nerds argue about that for no reason, but this is a really good character where it's just got these small little kind of elongated leaflets of anywhere from 3 to 5. Deerweed is a really cool plant reproductively because even though it's not in flower right now, when it does go into flower, it'll make these pretty little yellow pea-like flowers. And those flowers are adapted to indicate to pollinators that they've already been pollinated. So once they've been pollinated, they turn from that pretty yellow into kind of a deeper orange red color. So remember, all of these species are on the real strict energy budget, and so the more energy they can save and the more energy that the plant can save for its pollinators, the better off it'll be. So a bee's flying around and it doesn't waste its time looking for pollen where it's not going to find it. Acmispon glaber, deerweed, Fabaceae. All right, so we've worked our way up the trail a little ways, just a couple 100 yards down from where we were last, and now we're in the chaparral. And if you see this plant here, then you are in chaparral, without a doubt. This is the chaparral species. So this is commonly called chamise. It's in the rose family. Adenostoma fasciculatum is the scientific name, and fasciculatum is describing the leaves, these little kind of tiny sausage-like, succulent almost leaves that are alternately arranged, believe it or not, one leaf per node, but these nodes are so tight, the internodes are so short, that it looks like they're all coming out from the same place. It looks like it's world phyllotaxy, but this is not actually world phyllotaxy, it's alternate. So maybe for a quiz question, what is the phyllotaxy of this plant? And because they're all coming out of this same spot here, we call that a tuft or a fascicle, which is where it gets its name. So I told you that this is the chaparral plant, and because it's the chaparral plant, it is really, really well adapted to chaparral. So it makes these tiny leaves that really hold water in well. They can actually store water within their leaves. They do very little transpiration. So really well drought adapted. But also a really common characteristic of chaparral is that they, as we've told you, are adapted to fire. So these plants have been dealing with fire since they've been evolving. And so a really common strategy for fire, which we may have gone over already to this point, is to have some means of regenerating after a fire. So there's a couple different ways to do that. You can make it so that your seeds respond to smoke or some kind of compound that comes after a fire, and respond, by respond I mean they germinate. And that's true of chamise. So chamise seeds will respond to smoke, and in fact, you can even give them that liquid smoke that we used to cook with, and they'll germinate from that. Another way that you can respond after a fire is, you think of a fire burning at 700 degrees above the ground. If you go a foot below the soil, it's going to be a cool 85 degrees, 80 degrees under the soil. Soil's a really good insulator of heat. And so what these plants do, and you can kind of see because of the road cut here, is they keep a store of a bunch of stem cells, undifferentiated cells, which have come above the ground here, but this goes all the way down. And we call this a lignotuber. So what can happen here is after all the above ground foliage gets completely torched, then it's got all kinds of stem cells that it'll start regrowing from the base within weeks after that fire, oftentimes. And you'll see that all throughout Santa Barbara. As you all know, Santa Barbara is basically just a matchstick, and so you don't have to go very far to find a region that's been burned recently. And if and when you do, you'll see chamise regenerating from the base, and you'll probably even see a bunch of little chamise seedlings around as well. So another real common genus in chaparral, and this genus is really just iconic and characteristic for California. Most of these species are endemic to California, as a matter of fact, and and you've all probably heard of them. They're in the genus Arctostaphylos. So we're just going to hold you responsible for the genus in this case. Arctostaphylos and Manzanita is the common name for this group of plants. Manzanitas, you can pretty much always tell either it's a manzanita or it's maybe a madrone, because they have this nice, really smooth, smooth bark. And that's true of a lot of manzanitas. It's also not true of plenty of manzanitas, but this particular species bark is nice and smooth. And they also have that same lignotuber, or burl we call it down here. And this is always the first characteristic in a dichotomous key for manzanitas, is do they have a burl at the base or do they not have a burl? And Devin, if you zoom in over on this side of the burl, you can see some regrowth happening from this lignotuber right down here. So this plant probably thinks, quote, that it's been burned, which really what happened was just a trail crew came through and cut this branch here. And so it thinks it's been burned, and it's doing some regeneration from the base here. This plant is in the Ericaceae, and not the Ericaceae that palms are in with an A, but this is the Ericaceae, which blueberries are in. And this plant makes flowers indicative of that family, of course. We're in chaparral, so the leaves are going to be nice and tough, leathery. Sclerophilus is another name for that word, and this is a pretty standard manzanita leaf here. That word manzanita comes from the Spanish word manzana, which means apple. So the fruits, a lot of people think, look like little apples. Well, I really wish you guys were here right now, because we are just getting into the wonderland. I hope that you are able to go find a wonderland of your own somewhere, wherever you are. It's out there, and now's the time. We're looking back down into the San Ynez Valley there with the Sierra Madre Range in the background. The San Ynez River would be cutting through that valley, and you can see all the different shades of green down there. So all of our deciduous oaks, which are leafing out, probably some alders and sycamores and so on down there as well, and all this just new growth and new spring. You can see Blue Dog over there is just out of his mind, happy. His tongue's almost hitting the ground, and we've now entered into we're still in the chaparral, but this is kind of a foothill woodland or savanna little pocket here, and that is aptly named after this foothill pine here. It's a pine, so it's in the Pinaceae family. It's a gymnosperm, so these things evolved before plants were even making those real nice reproductive structures and flowers. This one is Pinus sabiniana. So the foothill pine, we call it, or the gray pine. the ugly pine, ghost pine. There's all kinds of names for this particular species of pine. And one of the reasons it gets that name, the ugly pine, is because of the canopy. And I don't happen to agree with that terminology, but people will call it the ugly pine because it doesn't look like a normal pine necessarily. Usually pines are kind of have this conical shape where it's a clear top that tapers out toward the base, where these foothill pines tend to kind of branch irregularly, and their canopy looks maybe more like an oak or something like that. But these are also called gray pines because you're seeing some in the background there and this one up close. Once again, they also have a waxiness to their leaves, which are in this case needles. And it gives the whole tree kind of a gray hue to it. So pretty much the first character that we look at when we're trying to identify a pine is how many needles does it have in every bundle, or in this case we're going to use that word fascicle once again. And so for this particular plant, we're pretty much always going to find 3. Sometimes you'll find an anomalous 2 or 4 or whatever, but for the most part this is a 3-needle pine, and you can be real sure that one needle hasn't fallen off because when you put all of the needles together, they each form a little slice of that full pizza circle that this thing made when this leaf was just first developing. So as far as pine needles go, these are pretty tough, and they're pretty long as well. We're lucky enough to find a cone from this species here, which as far as pine cones go, this one's on the larger side of things. You can distinguish it not only by its size, but its kind of light brown color. And this little feature down here on the end of this scale is a kind of a fun word that I don't think we're going to hold you responsible for, but it's nice to know, called an umbo or an umbo. And that's that little kind of prickle here on the edge of the spine. So that prickle kind of curves up, and it's pretty sharp for the foothill pine. You find foothill pines on slopes, real typically with blue oaks. So typically where you're going to find blue oaks, you'll find foothill pines, and you'll find them, you can look at a really nice range map in your textbook, but you'll see that foothill pines occur all the way up into Northern California as well as into Southern California, and make that nice loop around the Central Valley as many of our iconic California species do. So we're lucky enough to not only find a cone from this pine, but we also found a cone with a couple of seeds in it. So here's a seed from this cone that's actually pretty big as far as pine cones go. And it's big and it's full of oil. And so let's see if we can crack it open. So and this sandstone isn't really working, so maybe my knife will. So that was pretty botched, but you can see I popped it open. And if I was an indigenous person, or if I had a pine nut factory, then I would be much better at opening that. But what we just saw there was a seed coat around the inner seed, and that seed is loaded with all kinds of oils and fats and protein and so on that made up a really important part of the indigenous people's diet here. So this is the foothill pine. It's a really iconic California tree to get to know. Drought tolerant. You'll see it with blue oaks. Know it, love it, remember it. It's right there. Look at it. There it is. Seed on the scale. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a modified branch. We've talked, hopefully by this point, that plants make leaves, seeds, and leaves, stems, and roots. Those are the 3 structures they make, and anything that looks different than that, like a flower or a cone or whatever it may be, is just some modified version of that. So this is a modified branch. It's a modified branch. It's been modified to do meiosis and do sexual reproduction. And so in this case, we've got some stem tissue, and then they'll make a leaf and a bud. Stem, leaf, and a bud. And that's kind of easier to see on a cone like the one that Douglas fir makes, which we won't get an opportunity to see this quarter. But what you're looking at here is some stem, a leaf, and a bud, which are these scales here, these scales that have grown out and become real woody and tough over the course of a couple of years. And Blue, get out of here. And this is where meiosis is happening. And in this case, this is a female cone. And we know that not only because of the size, but because it was making seeds as well, which we just did a close-up on. And I'm gonna see if, yeah, there we go. So out pops the seed there. So on all plants in the Pinaceae, I think all, for the most part, at least if it's not some kind of mutant plant, then they're on every scale, it's gonna make 2 seeds. And so you can always tell that because there's a couple of nice indentations where those seeds were. And then there's some other indentations where there's a little membranous wing on that seed. In this particular case, I think part of the wing has broken off, but that's what this membranous part along the seed is. So that membranous part comes off, and this is the seed itself. And this seed was not housed within an ovary, which it would have been if it was an angiosperm, which is why gymnosperms get this naked seed term. And so part of the seed coat here is this real hard structure, which I'm going to try not to botch completely, and I basically have. But yeah, really interesting that a lot of these, so you get this outer seed coat off, and a lot of these are pretty shriveled. So that would be your pine nut there that you would pay about $1/4 for. And that pine nut is all shriveled up, and I'm not sure exactly why, but a good looking pine nut for this thing would be much bigger than the pine nuts that you buy in the store, and actually tastier. And the reason that these aren't used commercially is because they don't make as many cones as the pines that are used for commercial pine nuts do, but they're real nutritious, full of fats and proteins and oils that the indigenous people really relied on. All right, foothill pine.
Hey guys, this is Devin speaking. I'm showing you now a plant we probably have already introduced to you, but this specimen we just found has some flowers on it, so we figured we'd come back and highlight these guys. This plant, if you can't already tell, is in the pea family, Fabaceae. You can tell by these little, what we term papillinaceous flowers. It's really hard to see as they're just coming out, but they have 5 petals. That one looks all right, actually. That larger top petal is called the banner. On the sides, it has 2 wings, and then it has 2 fused petals on the bottom called the keel. And that's a good way to generally identify any plants in the pea family, Fabaceae. And so this is Acmyspon glaber, commonly called deerweed. You can see it's just starting to flower now. And one cool thing I think Jason mentioned is that it has this way of indicating to pollinators whether it's ready to be pollinated. Let me see if I can get that back in focus. But you see that these newer flowers coming out here from this node are very yellow. You can see they're not even all the way emerged yet. But going down the stem, we see these flowers and petals that are a little darker, a little more red. And this just tells us that these have been open for a little bit longer, maybe a day or 2 more, indicating to pollinators that, well, these are probably not receptive to pollen anymore. Either they've already been pollinated or they've matured to the point where they may not be able to be fertilized. But yeah, this is deerweed.
All right, so we're still in the chaparral, but we've got a species that occurs both in chaparral as well as in coastal scrub. And if you came up close to it and you're standing here, then there's all kinds of clues as to what family this plant is in. So you can see, probably even from back there, that there are 2 leaves at every node. If you came up closer, then you would see that the stems are pretty darn square here. And then we've got these bunches of flowers that work their way up in these little bundles in a terminal inflorescence here. And then we crack a leaf, and boy, does that smell good. So we're in the mint family for sure here, and commonly when we see inflorescences that look like this, then that's also an indicator that within the mint family we're in the genus Salvia. Salvia meaning well, and in this case we're looking at Salvia mellifera. Mellifera means honey bearing. So all the classic characteristics of a sage, where this one smells particularly good, I think. It's kind of a more peppery, savory smell than something like a hummingbird sage, which is sweeter. We've talked about the floral morphology of plants in the Lamiaceae or the mint family, but you're seeing that here with these tiny little mint flowers that can range anywhere in color from really white to a really pretty lavender color. So these plants are just starting to bloom right now. They are probably more common in coastal scrub, and one way that you can tell is you can walk through this plant without much problem. And I actually love when Blue over there walks through this particular plant because he smells really nicely like sage for a few days, whereas if you were to try to walk through that chemise, you'd come out with some blood. So black sage, a really common, important plant in California. There you have it. All right, so we're not quite doing belly botany yet, but we're at least on our knees, so that's a good sign that your nerd meter is starting to kind of tip. And so we're going to learn a common wildflower throughout a lot of California. You'll see that range map in your textbook. But this is a monocot, and there's all kinds of clues to show you that. You've got this long strap-like leaf with the veins that are totally parallel oriented. If you looked closely at the flower, you would see that there are parts in multiples of 3. In this case, there's 6. It would have a fibrous root system. This is definitely a monocot, and this is a plant in the Themidaceae. The genus is Dicalostoma capitatum, and I believe the genus was recently changed. A friend of mine told us that recently, but we're going to stick with Dicalostoma, and Blue Dix is the common name. Hopefully you're all chuckling at home, and I think that common name, from what I understand and what's in your textbook, is just derived from a shortening of the name of the genus. Before that was a real colloquial term like it is now. So some characters to describe Blue Dix. It looks like it might be an annual, but this is actually a perennial plant that comes up from an underground bulb every year. And you always know when and where it's coming because it'll make these 2 or 3 or so strap-like long leaves. And then when it's time to flower, it'll shoot up a terminal inflorescence here in this nice little umbel. And like we already showed you, the parts are in 6. They can range anywhere from a light pink to this dark purple color. Yeah, real common and classic wildflower for California, Blue Dix. So we've made our way down the hill a little ways. We're out of the chaparral, and as you can see, I'm standing in shade, so I'm definitely not in chaparral. And we're back into kind of the oak woodland where it's a lot wetter. I'm being fanned by a nice, what is this plant here? What is the reason I'm not touching it? Poison oak. It's actually just about to be in full bloom. But under the poison oak is one of my favorite species of plant in general, definitely one of my favorite ferns. And this is a coffee fern. So coffee ferns evolved before even gymnosperms did, or at least this group of plants evolved before gymnosperms did. And they evolved before plants started making pollen. Before they started making ovaries, they were reproducing via spores. And You learned about that in 127, and we'll probably talk some more about that in lectures. But what you're seeing here is one compound leaf, or frond we call them when they are ferns. This is the coffee fern, and Devin just inquired, maybe it got its name because the leaflets here look like little coffee beans, and that may be true. Also, the leaf stalk here kind of looks like coffee with cream, and it's just a really elegant brown color here, real smooth. Coffee ferns occur in all different kinds of habitats. You'll see them in the understory of an oak woodland like this, but there's also species that have adapted to chaparral and even in the desert, which is real rare for ferns, especially because their sperm need water to make it to an egg. So this is a really nice specimen here, and we're actually seeing a little fiddleneck down here. This is just a little baby frond that's on its way to unfurling here, and you can see all the tiny little leaflets. These leaflets, which have already done all their cell division that they're going to do, they have the same number of cells as this big leaf, this leaf has here, and over the course of this leaf's life, it's just going to, those cells are all going to mature and expand and so on. As we know, ferns reproduce with spores. So I was saying that this is a fern. Ferns reproduce via spores, and spores are housed within those nice little Spartan helmets, those sporangia. And the way that sporangia are oriented, typically on the underside of a frond, can really be indicative of that species and unique to a certain species. So this group of ferns in this family is the Pteridaceae, which is Pteridaceae. And one common characteristic of plants in this family is that they don't make a true indusium where they make separate tissue aside from the leaf here and cover the spores with that. They make what we call a false indusium. And what a false indusium is, as we all know, is the margin of that leaflet folds over and hugs over the sporangia. So we're seeing that here, where there's all the sporangia, and at this point the leaflet is kind of exposing those sporangia. Sorry, Devin.
You're good.
But you can see all of them under that false indusium there. So coffee fern, I don't know if I said the species, the genus is Pelea andromedifolia. Pelea andromedifolia. Okay, so right next to the coffee fern that we just saw, we're going to do another species of fern, and this one we're going to call the Goldieback fern, which I know Natalie loves that name, and you see it growing along this trail cut right next to where the coffee fern was over there, and the scientific name is Pentagramma triangularis. Pentagramma triangularis. This is also in the same family, the Pteridaceae, and but unlike many species in the Pteridaceae, this particular fern puts its sporangia just kind of all over the underside of the frond, and for that reason, we can use this plant to give ourselves what we call a botany badge. So if you have a dark colored cotton shirt, then you can press the leaf against yourself and give it a nice little smack and end up with a nice little botany stamp right there, which is just a bunch of sporangia. And your friends are going to love you for that one. So I love Pentagramma. It's one of those ferns which is common for this Pteridaceae family to have these real dark, almost black, real dark brown, elegant leaf stalks here that are just shiny and smooth and beautiful. Pentagramma triangularis, which it almost has 5 sides to it, hence the genus, but triangularis because it makes a nice triangular shape there. Goldieback fern.
When you're ready.
Cool. So once again, among the poison oak, we have another species of fern in the Pteridaceae, Pteridaceae. And this one you've definitely seen. This is a really common house plant. You see it on people's desks and in their kitchens and so on. And this is another plant in the Terradaceae that makes a false indusium. And even though you can't see sporangia on this particular frond, you can see that the margin of the leaf is folded over. So this is the maidenhair fern, and it's in the genus Adiantum. The species of this one is Jordanii. Adiantum jordanii, or the maidenhair fern. And just like we saw with the Goldieback fern, the leaf stalk here is really kind of shiny and almost black looking, really elegant. The leaflets in this case are kind of fan shaped, almost shaped like a ginkgo leaf. And they can have some kind of tears in the margin, but this frond is a version of a compound leaf, of course. This is all one leaf that's been subdivided into these smaller leaflets here. So this is the maidenhair fern. What we're also seeing among the poison oak is some galium here. And galium, or bedstraw, we're just going to hold you responsible for the genus. There's a nice oak catkin that's fallen onto it. But there are many species of galium in California, and this is one of the rare Mediterranean species in the coffee family, or the Rubiaceae. And most plants in this family are tropical, but we have many galium in California, and some good ways to tell them apart are, this is actually one of the rare cases when we have world phyllotaxy. So at every node in all of the California species, there are 4 leaves per node, at least all the California species I know. That's probably not true of all the California species. There's 4 leaves per node, and both on the leaves and the stem are these little hooks, and it almost acts like Velcro. So they'll totally stick to your shirt. And right next to my botany stamp is my botany badge here with galium. Bed straws, which were thought to be the packing in Jesus Christ's pillow, a bunch of dried galium, which is why they call them bed straws. They make these nice, pretty little white flowers that'll pop out of the axils there when it's time to do that. So we're just holding you responsible for the genus. This is a California native species right here, but then there are also one of the most common species that we'll see of galium in California is an introduced one. And you can tell this one apart because it's got anywhere from 6 to 8, whatever, leaves at every node, also with world phyllotaxy. And this one makes an even better botany badge. It's even harder to take off once it's stuck. So there's the genus Galium. Now that I've gotten down closer with my good eye, I'm seeing another species that I'd like to go over here, which is the snowberry and the creeping snowberry. This pretty delicate little plant here with opposite leaves, kind of reddish stems. Its leaves are in this sort of egg shape here. It's in the genus Symphoricarpus mollis. And it's in the Caprifoliaceae, which is the honeysuckle family. So it makes these pretty little pink-white honeysuckle-like flowers. And there aren't any fruits out right now, but it makes a really weird fruit that looks like just a white to pinkish little egg. And they look really appetizing, and because they tend to hang out even after this thing has gone deciduous for the year, which this is a deciduous plant, the fruits still persist, and it doesn't really seem like they get eaten. So it's thought that those fruits have some poisonous characters to them, as you'll read in your textbook.
Hey guys, Devin here. Figured I'd jump in front of the camera for a bit and go over a plant hopefully you guys are a little familiar with by now. I'll get down here. So you've probably seen this growing nearby. Sometimes it grows on, I want to say, maybe not roadsides, but just on trails and maybe parks. This is purple nightshade, Solanum xanthi. You can see it's got this nice fused corolla, a sympedalous corolla, consisting of 5 petals that are all kind of one now. And this is in the same family as tomatoes and potatoes, Solanaceae. Looking a bit closer at the leaves in the phyllotaxy, we see that this plant has alternately arranged leaves with pretty hairy stems and leaves, and these hairs are glandular, so it feels a little bit sticky to the touch. Looking back to the flower, we see these nice bright yellow stamens surrounding a single pistil. And Jason, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this would have 5 fused carpels. And once these guys are pollinated and start to fruit, the fruits are berries, just like tomatoes, but do not eat these because, as a lot of plants in the nightshade group are known for, they are very poisonous. And I don't know about this species, but I know that some, like deadly nightshade, can kill people. And yeah, so purple nightshade here, Solanum xanthi.
I really wish you could have been here today, but hopefully this is just a little inspiration for you to get out to some local trails around your house and go looking for some of these new friends that you've made. As well as when you get to come back to Santa Barbara, or maybe if you're already here, to come up and over Highway 154 and check out the San Ynez River and this side of things, and you can eventually follow this trail all the way up about 4 miles up to Knapp's Castle and East Camino Cielo Road, which I'm sure some of you have been up to already. So just to wrap up, we walked through some oak woodland, up through into some coastal scrub and chaparral ecotones, made our way into a little grassland and saw some foothill oak woodland, and back down through that riparian area and understory of the oak woodland, and learned some fern species. So thanks for joining. Can't wait to see you for the next field trip.